Hey guys, a lot of information this week, so I'll try to keep it as short as I can. You guys know we've just finished our 5 weeks on relational God, and so now we're going to jump into our epic fail series. And so in a nutshell, it's when I mess up or when bad things happen to me, how do I kind of fail with grace? Knowing that there's a God that wants to have a relationship with me, or a God that I have a relationship with, how do I then interact with failure in light of this knowledge, basically? And so our general tendency is we mess up and we wallow in it, or bad things happen to us and we wallow in kind of the injustice of it. And so we're going to spend 5 weeks talking about kind of some narratives from the Bible where people have either really messed up and gotten up for it, or had terrible things happen to them and have managed, because of their relationship with God, to kind of power through it in a sense. And because typically what happens and what you find is that kids that have lasting faith, they have this understanding that it's not necessarily about the rules, it's about the relationship that I have with God. But even in the midst of that, okay, there's still rules. So what do I do when I can't, when I goof up? And so that's what we're going to be talking about over the next 5 weeks. So this week we're going to be talking about Joseph's story. Dude who had a lot of really bad things happen to him, but in the midst of his relationship, because he had a relationship with God, was able to turn it into some really awesome things. And some common themes we're going to look at through the story are kind of pain and fear always being brought on by uncertainty, but in contrasting that, is this confidence that's brought on by God and having a relationship with God, and this freedom that kind of comes from that, even in the midst of really terrible situations. So what kind of we see as fear and as pain, God's able to turn into a confidence in the end. And our key verse through the whole thing, or that we'll end up getting to at the end, is when Joseph talks to his family and he says, it's all good. Everything's great because the things that you meant for evil, God meant for good, and so it's fine. And so, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So we'll start out talking about fear because it's very tangible and it's very relatable. So I'll start out in the very beginning with a story about a time I was afraid just because I was uncertain about something. And then we'll kind of let it be a little heavier. Okay, so maybe you're not afraid because for a silly reason like I was in my story, but maybe you're afraid because there's some uncertainty in your life based on a parent's divorce and you don't know what it's going to look like, or the future, you can't see it, it makes you nervous, or one situation or another. And so we're going to talk about the things that make kids fearful in their groups, the things that they're afraid of, basically. And they're all going to stem down to uncertainty. When we don't know what's going to happen, even when we do know what's going to happen, it's like we don't know what it's going to feel like or look like, and so it kind of throws us for a loop. And so so that'll be the first thing that the groups talk about, and then we'll come back together and we're going to start walking through Joseph's story. Now it's a lot of scripture in that it's just a big chunk of scripture, but it's a little bit segmented. So if you want to read the points of the stories that we're going to highlight, I'll make sure I'll include them in the email so that you see the specific chunks that I'm going to highlight. But basically, I think I break it down into about 4 parts. The first part being just the beginning, Joseph's dad favoring him and his brothers not liking him for it, so they sell him into slavery. In the midst of that, obviously, there's fear and there's pain, but on the other side of it, there's comfort because God's with Joseph. And so then he goes to Potiphar's house, and dude does really well, thrives in the situation, but then everything happens with Potiphar's wife, and he's thrown back into jail. And so all of a sudden he's hopeless, and there's this fear and this pain, but God turns it into something awesome in the end, and so there's comfort from God in that time, and then so then he's in prison, and dude even does well in prison. He thrives in prison, and all these good things happen to him, and so even in the midst, once again, even in the midst of his pain, even in the midst of his uncertainty, God's there and brings him a confidence that he couldn't have on his own, and so then I'm going to, with the middle school group, not the high school group, the middle school group at this point will break into their groups. The high school group, we're going to go all the way through the story and then leave you guys with like the connecting points for the rest of the time together. So you guys will have that full 25 minutes. Middle schoolers, at this point, you'll break. And when we come back together, you'll kind of talk about that. And we'll have some specific questions to help them process that. But then when we come back, we're going to watch a clip from the movie Keela and the Bee, and I will include that YouTube link so that you're able to watch it. And so then for the middle schoolers, then we'll continue on with the story. High schoolers will never stop. And so we'll walk all the way through the story and about how Joseph eventually, because he does so well in prison and interprets some dreams and things like that, he eventually goes to be like the number 2 in command, basically, of all of Egypt. And eventually is reunited with his family and is able to kind of reconcile. And that's where that kind of our key verse comes in. And it's in that... and it's from Genesis 50, 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended for good to accomplish what is now being done to save many lives. And so Joseph is just a great example of someone who, in the midst of a terrible situation, relies on God and allows God to transform the situation into something good. And so then in our lives, it's very much, we have this option of, do we wallow in it? Do we sit in it when bad things happen? Or do we get up and do we let it be something awesome? And so this is a great example of someone who, even in the midst of terrible things happening to him, who's very much innocent in most of it, allows God to turn the situation into something awesome. Somebody who is a great example of someone who fails with a great deal of grace. And so that's what we're talking about this week. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to contact us. And we hope you have a great weekend. Thanks.